Hello and welcome to Lois and Morgana Davidson Art. It's Morgana here, and this week I'll be demonstrating this loose sunset landscape painting for you in watercolour. I'm starting with some Milford brand watercolour paper, size 1/4 imperial, upon which I have just penciled in, as you can see here, a couple of simple building outlines, just very lightly, nothing too complicated. I've put them about a third of the way down the paper, and I've used my Pebeo brand drawing gum to just mask the shapes out to protect them while I put down the first wash. So here you can see I've got my paper already taped onto my board. I've got it laying flat on my tabletop. You can see the masking fluid is there over the buildings to protect them, and I'm just going to put down a wash of clean water to begin with. The colours I'll be using today are on screen at the moment. I'll pop a full list of everything that I'm going to be using in the video description as per usual. But for now, all I'm doing is washing this entire piece of paper with some clean water, ready to put down a nice wet and wet sky wash. And starting very boldly with a sweep of this lovely rich colour. This is alizarin crimson hue from Winsor & Newton's Tottenham range. It's just the loveliest red. I really enjoy painting with this because it worked so well with other colours that are favourites of mine, such as ultramarine and indigo, which both of which you're going to see today. And I wanted a really sort of bold and dynamic sunset, which is why I'm using this red really quite heavily, and I'm just pulling it lengthways across the paper using my large 2-inch wash brush to get some good coverage over this larger surface. Now here is some ultramarine going in here, putting this underneath the alizarin crimson quite heavily because we want those sort of bluish dusty shades of evening creeping in along the bottom of the painting there. And just for a little slight difference along the top here, I am adding in some raw sienna, and I'm just doing this using a mop brush now, just to get a little bit more different shaped brush strokes in. You can see I've only added it very lightly, and I'm bringing the rest of the colours up towards the top of the paper and just marbling that in slightly. And the mop brush here gives me a little bit more control over the shapes I'm able to create within the sky. So we use the large brush to get good coverage, and then the mop brush to add in any slightly more sort of detailed sweeps of colour. Like here, I'm using it to just add in very quickly and very simply a foreground made from a blend of perylene green and some indigo, with plenty of water to soften the colours down, because those are both quite powerful colours. As you can see here, they're going on really nicely against our sort of soft, dusty sky backdrop. Now at this point, while we've still got plenty of water on the paper, I'm using some richer, more concentrated paint to start building up a distant tree line, sort of going along this sort of lower third here, and of course because it's going over the buildings which I've masked out, so it's going to be in the distance behind these lovely smaller buildings here. And I'm just very loosely building this up. You can see I've put in a few details with the large brush, but now I've just switched to a smaller brush here. It's just a small round size 4 from Princeton and Neptune. You can see I'm just using it to pull these darker shapes very loosely just up against that ruby glow of the sky there, and just creating these loose darker areas in the painting that's going to contrast really nicely with the pale colour that we've got going on in the foreground. So at this point I'm just going to allow those shapes to sort of keep diffusing upwards into the sky, and I'm just going to use a handy little trick here to create a nice bright sun. I'm using a coin. I'm using a 5p piece, although you can use any coin or indeed any round circular object that you have to hand. I'm wrapping it nice and tightly in a piece of clean tissue so that I get that round shape, and then just a simple press and lift into the wet paint lifts out a lovely clean circular shape, which I can then turn into a sun just by drifting a few soft dark clouds over it. I'm using the small brush again and some more alizarin crimson mixed with a touch of indigo and I think a touch of ultramarine to soften it down slightly, and I'm just going to turn these little wispy parts here into some low hanging sort of wispy cloud that's just going to drift across that sun there and just sort of soften it into the painting. And at this point I'm using a slightly larger brush just for a softer line. For sort of a thinner, slightly harder lines, use a smaller brush. This is a mid-size round that I was just using here. And just adding more ultramarine just makes these clouds slightly darker, and you can see we're still working wet in wet here. The paper is still quite nice and wet, and the lines that I'm putting in for the clouds are sort of softening really nicely at the edges and blurring into that, that lovely red-pink coloured sky. Now, just for good measure, I'm adding a quick spatter of colour across the foreground. This is the sort of misty colour that I was using to create the dusty cloud, so it's basically a mixture of a bit of alizarin crimson, a little bit of ultramarine as well. And I just spattered it across the foreground really loosely, using the round brush that I was using to do the clouds, and then pulling the fan brush as well for a little bit of extra ultramarine spatter there. I'm going to let those diffuse. Those are going to become some nice loose flowers in the foreground, and while I wait for this to dry, I'm just cleaning up the masking fluid slightly with a piece of tissue, just mopping up any excess paint that might have pooled on the surface of the masking fluid there, just because that makes it so much easier to remove cleanly when the time comes. So now this is completely dry and I can start the next layer. I'm beginning with a texture brush to just add some really quick and simple detail. These sort of loose marks that I made for the misty distant trees have worked really beautifully. Really pleased with how they've come out, so I'm not going to do too much to them. I just wanted a little bit of extra sort of sharper texture just in the front here, creating this sort of little hedgerow moment. Which is the easiest to do if you do wet on dry, which is what I'm doing here, wet paint onto dry paper. And now I'm happy with that, so I'm just going to continue by enhancing some of these lovely tree shapes here using a really fine brush and some quite light paint. This is Perylene Green, but it's mixed down with quite a lot of water, so it will dry quite light. And I'm just drawing in the thinnest, wispiest little branches across these tree shapes, just to enhance the shapes that are already there, so to speak. So you're not creating trees out of nothing, rather the trees are already there. We're just using this technique to just bring them into focus a little bit for the viewers of this painting. Now, as you can see here, I'm using my trusty sword liner brush to put in this detail, just because it's got a really nice fine tip, and I'm very used to using it, so it works quite well for me. But at this point, use any thin brush that works well for you, so just a nice fine liner brush, or a rigger, or anything really like a round brush that comes to a nice thin point will work for you here. And you just want to continue going across the tree line and just following the same procedure in all of the sort of marks that you want to turn into these lovely wispy trees. So I'm just going to do that across this tree line here, just off camera quickly, so we can move on to the next step, which is just adding an extra little bit of splatter detail in this foreground here. And these are just smaller marks than I made earlier, just because it's the wet paint going onto dry paper, so they're not blooming out and creating these larger shapes. But for the shapes that I created earlier, what I'm doing here is using the fine brush to add these very, very thin stalks to turn them into a meadow full of loose flowers. And this is quite delicate. Again, I'm using the tip of my sword liner brush, which as you can see is giving me these nice thin lines. But again, use whichever fine brush works the best for you. So here you can see in these little clusters you can add the stalks very loosely, taking a little bit more care with some of the individual blooms. But I really like this effect. This turns this sort of random loose scatter into little clusters of beautiful poppies perhaps, or other wildflowers. So I've gone ahead and done the rest of the field just off camera quickly, and once that's all dry and all done, we can go ahead and remove the masking fluid here from these buildings. You can see they stayed lovely and white throughout the painting process. And once the masking fluid is gone, we're ready to paint in these shapes. So I wanted to keep some colour harmony here, so I'm not digging out my sort of brown colours or traditional sort of wood colours. Instead, I'm sticking with the colours that I've already got on my palette, and I've loosely mixed up some alizarin crimson, some indigo, a bit of Payne's grey. I think there's a touch of ultramarine in there as well. My palette gets quite messy sometimes, and colours bleed over into one another, but sometimes that's all to the good because it creates these lovely, interesting sort of shades of colour here. Like we've got this lovely dust-like colour, and I'm basically using some extra water to pull that colour across this section of the building, leaving a small space for a door, just that simple detail there. And again, I'm using my small round brush for this, but I think a small flat brush would serve you really well here for these nice sort of straight lines. A flat brush always helps you to get a nice straight line. And here you can see I'm dotting in some darker paint, just a slightly more concentrated version of the paint that I'm currently using, just along this top line here, which is just going to give us a bit of shadow underneath the roof. And now I'm just going to use some more of the same colour, but again a little bit richer paint, slightly more concentrated, so less water, and that's just going to be the colour that I use for the roof here. So you can see I'm filling it in quite loosely, again using my little round brush, but I'm also going to leave some of the white paper sort of peeping through here, just so we get the illusion of some glints of light, just sort of catching on the roof tiles, perhaps the gleam of last light from that setting sun. So for this, if you are very skilled at dry brush, I think this section you could just very simply dry brush quite easily and it would look lovely. I would like to do dry brush over larger areas, though I don't think I'd quite trust myself doing it over this small roof, so I'm just filling it in quite carefully. I just zoom my camera in here so you can see in a little bit more detail. I'm just coming in with my fine detail brush now to just add a bit of Payne's grey just on this left side here to deepen the shadows and just to add a little bit more definition. But you can see as well, I hope, on the roof there I've left these tiny little glints of white peeping through the roof to just give that illusion of the sun glinting off the roof tiles and off some of the edges. And here I'm using Payne's grey again, just brushing it very lightly over this small section that I've left for the door, just to create that weathered look, but also to still keep it nice and loose and not to worry too much about a sort of heavy detail. Just rub a little bit of paint over there and you can see just a small dot for a door handle there. Now I'm using my texture brush again to just create a little bit of overgrown greenery coming up around the side of this lovely old building. really simply, and that's just a bit of Perylene green that I'm using there. And now to just add an extra little bit of interest, I'm back to using my fine detail brush, and I'm just pulling some strands of the Perylene green up out of this sort of delicate shrubbery area, so some creeping vines or some tendrils of ivy perhaps coming up from this section of greenery, and just casting their tendrils and their fingers across the side of this lovely little cottage. I'd love to know if anybody perhaps has a story they can think up about this old abandoned building. It doesn't seem particularly large, but it does seem abandoned. I do always love my paintings to have a story, and I do think this one lends itself particularly to a slightly fairy tale-esque sense, but perhaps that's just me and my imagination. So if you can come up with a suitable tale that seems to be woven around this abandoned building, perhaps a cottage, perhaps a farmhouse, then please let me know in the comments. Perhaps it will turn into something larger than just this painting. But for now, I shall content myself to painting in a flight of birds to just finish this painting off. I do so love to add birds into paintings, and I think this scene here is just perfect for a lovely flight of some kind of bird, perhaps rising up from that distant tree line, or perhaps coming down with the setting of the sun, coming down to roost. So here we are with the finished painting. Thank you everybody so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this. I for one had an absolutely lovely time painting this particular scene. It really called to me with that lovely ruby red glow of sunset. I think there's something so romantic and lovely about this scene. But I'd love to hear what you think. Please let me know in the comments down below. Again, I hope you enjoyed it. Huge thank you to those of you who've come over to support me on my Patreon page. Hugely grateful for you all being there. But that's all from me for this video for this week. So wherever you are in the world, whatever you're up to, I wish you a wonderful rest of the day and very happy painting.